Hi folks, welcome to Epochs, where I'm joined by Bo, and we are going to be talking about the tumultuous times of Henry III. Now, I've got to be honest, I actually don't know much about Henry III. I know a lot about the time period in which he lived, but he doesn't seem that interesting. And he seems to be bookended by two more interesting kings.
Yeah, you can absolutely be forgiven for knowing less about him than a lot of the others, and for exactly that reason. All historians, even Shakespeare, noted that John is really interesting for being a baddie,
Yeah.
if you like. And his son, who is Edward I, Edward Longshanks,
Yeah.
who also has a long 30-plus-year-long reign and lots of adventures and daring do. And then Henry III, as you say, bookended by them, it pales in comparison.
Right.
He's outshone by their glare. Very much so, yeah. Because he ruled for a long time, he became king at 9 when his father John died of dysentery unexpectedly. So he was a boy king, ruled in his minority, and ruled for sort of 55, 56 odd years, so a long reign. But he wasn't a martial king. He didn't have a massive personality. In fact, he was quite pious. He's known as one of the most pious kings. His sort of, I suppose you could say, his greatest achievement was rebuilding Westminster Abbey. So that gives you a sort of a measure of the man. He's more interested in spending his treasure on abbeys than on fighting in France.
There's definitely something to be said for it. And I imagine that the average person is like, oh, thank God, just 50 years of peace.
Well, no, there was no peace. It wasn't massive chevauchés through France, but it was a really tumultuous time. So this episode, we are going to talk obviously all about Henry III, Henry of Winchester, he was called. But the times are very turbulent, very turbulent. It's the 13th century. So, I mean, let's just get straight into it.
Okay.
Got a whole bunch of quotes from Churchill, as usual. I do think Churchill, from Richard and John through to Edward III, I would say, is probably the best bit for me of the history of the English-speaking peoples. So I shall continue quoting from Churchill for the next couple anyway. Here's a general quote. He said, "It was a reign of turmoil and distress, and yet the forces of progress moved doggedly forward. Red-hot iron was smitten on the anvil," this is a metaphor, "red-hot iron was smitten on the anvil, and the hammer blows forged a metal more tense than had yet been seen. In this period, the common people, with their Anglo-Saxon tradition of ancient rights and law running back to remote antiquity, lay suffering under the armoured feet of the nobility and of the royal mercenaries, reinforced in the main by the power of the church. But the people's masters were disunited. Not only did their jealousies and ambitions and their taste for war keep them at variance, but several rending fissures were opening among them. They were divided into parties. They were cross-cut obliquely by a strong nationalism. It is an age of impulse and experiment, not controlled by any general political theory." So I think that one of the takeaway things is that there's a couple of big revolts happen during Henry's reign.
Oh, was this the Peasants' Revolt?
That's later.
Yeah.
Of course, he starts his reign in the middle of John's sort of civil war. Then there's a much bigger baronial revolt in the sort of middle or towards the end of his reign, and that's the one with Simon de Montfort.
Right.
So the story of Henry III, the takeaway thing is that it's wrapped up in the story of Simon de Montfort and the second Baron's revolt. So they're the main things, but lots of other themes are worthy of note. His sort of relationship with the church, the laws, all sorts of things. But we'll get into it. So if we pick up from when John died.
Yep.
Churchill said, "King John died in his toils, but he died at bay." In other words, he was still in the Civil War, but not being chased or anything.
I mean, he was winning the Civil War.
Right, he looked like he was starting to win, yeah. Although Louis the Lion was holding London, so it was far from over.
But he was getting the upper hand.
So you can imagine, can't you, that the party around the boy Henry III, led at least in part by William the Marshal, you can imagine when John dies, they're like, oh, That's inconvenient, to say the least. Right, we're in the middle of something here.
Yeah.
The chips have been thrown high.
Yeah.
Nothing is inevitable here. We know there is the continuation of the Plantagenet line, but nothing like that could be taken for granted. Churchill said, the misgovernment of his reign, John's reign, had brought against him what seemed to be an overwhelming combination. He was at war with the English barons who had forced him to grant the charter. They had invited Louis, son of the implacable Philip, King of France, into the country to be their liege lord, and with him came foreign troops and hardy adventurers. The insurgent barons north of the Humber had the support of Alexander, King of the Scots. In the west, the rebellion was sustained by Llewellyn, the powerful Prince of North Wales. The towns were mainly against the king. London was vehemently hostile. The Cinque-Ports were in enemy hands. Winchester, Worcester and Carlisle, separated by the great distances of those times, were united in opposition to the crown. So although John had been going around being successful in various sieges and sort of putting down whoever he sort of came across, in general, he was still sort of up against it, if you like. Churchill says, on the other hand, the recreant king had sacrificed the status of the realm to purchase the unswerving aid of the papacy. A strong body of mercenaries, the only regular troops in the kingdom, were in John's pay. Some of the greatest warrior nobles, the venerable William the Marshal and the famous romantic Ranulph, Earl of Chester, with a strong following of the aristocracy, adhered to his cause. So even though a lot of the country's against him, he's got a few powerful, strong people on his side.
Well, he's got the only professional body of troops, which counts for a lot.
Yeah. Even Louis's army are sort of more mercenaries than they are, sort of regular troops. The mass of the people, bewildered by this new quarrel of their masters, on the whole inclined to the king against the barons, and certainly against the invading foreigners. Their part was only to suffer at the hands of both sides. Thus the forces were evenly balanced. Everything threatened a long, stubborn civil war and a return to the anarchy of Stephen and Maud. John himself, after a lifetime of subtleties and double-dealing, of illegal devices and sharp unexpected twists of religious policy, showed himself possessed in the last months of his life of a warlike energy and resource which astonished friend and foe. It was at this moment that he died of dysentery, aggravated by fatigue and too much food and drink. So that's where the story of Henry III kicks off. Now, I always feel sorry for these boy kings.
Can't be easy.
Right. Because apart from anything else, it's like perhaps being an heir or an heiress as a child today. Now imagine being a small child and your parents die and you're left hundreds of millions or something, or a billion. And you're going to grow up with a warped view. You're not going to be a well-balanced person, almost certainly, are you?
Yep.
It'd be very difficult, if not impossible, to sort of be normal. Imagine being 9 years old and being told you're king, and there's this whole party of barons, of warriors, and you're like dealing with the Pope and stuff.
I can't really.
Right, yeah,
I can't even imagine how difficult that is. I mean, I don't know what the perspective of a 9-year-old like that is. 'Cause I mean, my son's nearly 9, and I would wish something like that upon him.
Yeah, even if you have a sort of a small amount of wealth or power, it's the classic trope, isn't it, that child actors grow up to be all kinds of messed up.
Yeah.
And that's just that's like you've been on TV a bit.
I think that
And
might
it
be the
screws with
consequence of Hollywood, though.
Yeah, maybe.
Being Hollywood.
Probably, yeah. Well, there's that as well.
As much as it is like the fame. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that doesn't help. But yeah, I think the main issue would be who to trust. Like, you don't know anything. You're very ignorant of the world. And everyone around you is pretending to be your friend.
So, as I said there's basically a massive power struggle, a civil war in all but name, really, or a type of civil war going on, something approaching an anarchy. And there's sort of a royalist party and a rebel party. And so with William the Marshal effectively at the head of the royalist party, they haven't got London. Louis the Lion of France is in London. So they crown him somewhere else. Was it? I don't know if it was Winchester. It says in one of the quotes later, but they get him crowned, and it should really be in Westminster Abbey, because there is a Westminster Abbey, an older version of it before this. Henry III goes on to rebuild it, as I said. But it's the church, the Roman Catholic Church, that stand by Henry III, and he sort of never forgot that. And he sort of, grew up to be very, very pious and, completely Catholic. We're still long before the Reformation, aren't we? We're long before even Wycliffe. It's either Rome or nothing, sort of thing. And he, sometimes in people's minds, religion just clicks, and it becomes a massive part of their whole personality, their whole worldview. Because, of course, his father John was fairly irreligious, or seemed to use
hardly a good Christian.
He seemed to use religion as just one more tool in his toolbox of politics, rather than genuinely caring about his soul and things. So,
well, what I find with these sorts of people, and I think this is kind of reflected in Alfred the Great as well, when there are tremendous upheavals and huge amounts of political turmoil, and you are looking for something that you can claim is a singular, unvarnished good. There's no question as to whether I should do what is written in the Bible and follow Jesus' word and things like this. And this, I think, acts as a kind of point on a compass for these people through these difficult times.
For sure. There's solace in that, isn't there? That you've got confirmation from sort of the rest of the world, from most of society, saying this is morally correct.
Yeah. Well, that's the point, isn't it? It's not just solace. It's moral clarity.
Right.
Because a lot of the time you can have lots of different people around you with lots of different competing moral claims, and you don't know. And there's chaos everywhere. There's a perennial lack of information about almost everything that happens as well. Like we're very spoiled in the modern era with the amount of information we can get very, very quickly. One of the things that people don't realize about, and it literally going back to like before the radio, so up until like the Victorian era, is there was just ignorance, and they knew they didn't know what was happening in India until 3 months later a letter arrived, tell them, and things like this, that sort of thing. And this is just a perennial problem in history, is intelligence. And so if you've got chaos going on, it becomes, and you've got all these different claims being made against you. It's just easy to say, well, look, I'm going to follow what Jesus said, because that is obviously the correct thing and everyone agrees. There's no one who's going to say, well, no, that's not right. And so I think it's a kind of security.
Certainly in the first half of the 13th century,
Yeah.
there's no one saying, actually, the Pope is completely wrong.
There's no Richard Dawkins at this time.
Yeah. Actually, maybe we could say this now. I was going to leave it for a bit later, but let's quickly discuss it now.
Yeah.
The Albigenses.
We can.
So I mentioned this before even Wycliffe, who was a very, very early precursor to the Protestants.
Yeah.
One of the first people to say, there's nothing in the Bible here about popes and saints and revering Mary, and nothing in the Bible about relics, for example.
Nothing in the Bible about a Pontifex Maximus,
a
pagan high priest of Rome.
Or that you can literally pay money to have people pray on your behalf and things like this.
Yeah. Intercession with saints? What are you talking about? None of this makes any sense.
A lot of the stuff that Martin Luther and the Protestants in the 16th century had a problem with, people were still a couple of hundred years earlier making the point.
Yeah, it's not a new point. It's just Martin Luther writes down the 95 Theses and nails it to the door and says, look, this is BS. And if you are a biblical literalist and a strictly scripturalist, then you can't really argue the point, actually. These are all traditions that grew up out of the Roman pagan religion when it Christianized. Yeah,
there's all sorts of inconsistencies between the Gospels, and the Old Testament, and the way the Catholic Church conducted itself in the Middle Ages.
And also the general thesis of Jesus. If we're very briefly on the Albigensian Crusade and the Cathars. The Cathars had a very strong argument because they called themselves the good Christians, and they would walk barefoot around the land in black robes, and they would set up little shops in various towns where a few of them would just spin wool or do whatever it was to make a living, and they would live as Jesus lived, as in poor, among the poor, helping the poor. They would take vows of celibacy when they reached sort of middle age, and they would do good works in exactly the way they believed Jesus was represented to do in the Bible. This is very persuasive when the other side of the argument is a massive gilded papal retinue of a cardinal or something like that, who's on horseback, who has giant landed estates, who himself has thousands of pounds of gold and dozens of armed men. And you say, well, you're not really the Christian here, are you? Because if Jesus came back, who is he going to approve of? And of course, the argument was with the Cathars and not the Pope. And just to cut it all very short, the Pope couldn't win the argument, and so he killed them all.
And not just the Pope, your local bishop.
Yeah, sorry.
Your local abbot. Yeah, it's like...
Yeah, sorry, actually, the Catholic Church entirely couldn't win the argument. And so they called a crusade, and so crusaders would march around Languedoc, besieging castles and massacring heretics.
So they would say things like, well, in the Bible, Jesus seems to be extremely interested in sort of helping the poor and being fair. And there's nothing really about hoarding wealth.
In fact, Jesus has several dictums against hoarding wealth, actually.
Or
give away all your wealth and follow me if you want to enter the kingdom of God. It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than a camel to go through the eye of the needle. Things like this. It's obvious that Jesus isn't pro-luxury.
There's nothing here in the Bible about sort of an ecclesiastical tax collecting structure. And we're going to build giant cathedrals and abbeys and monasteries, and there's nothing about that. So why am I sort of compelled to give the church money all the time and things? Yeah. Why are they collecting? And
just as a quick thing as well, there's strong anti-clerical movements all over Europe at this time, because the church has very clearly become a temporal power rather than a spiritual power. I mean, much of the legends of Robin Hood, people think, oh, Robin Hood must have been against the king. No, Robin Hood was a staunch royalist. Robin Hood was against the church. Robin Hood went around robbing monks all the time because the monks would have massive sacks of gold because the monks had been extorting people on religious grounds for their money. And that's just, the reflection of it in England. That's the way that the English peasantry remembered it. The Cathars are the sort of, the Occident version of that. And you've got various other, in Germany and everywhere else, you've got various other anti-clerical movements because the church has become a physical power in the real world that is exercising direct political power under people like Innocent III, who calls the Albigensian Crusade. And so you can see why people would say, well, this isn't really very Christian, actually.
A bit later, there's in the actual Reformation, there's all sorts of examples, like the Anabaptists, very, very hard, like all Puritanism, really. Calvin, lots of people saying, no, we can do away with all sort of finery and popery, and we're not going to... So anyway,
there are ones that precede the Cathars as well. It's theorised that the Cathars are kind of the descendants of the Bogomils, who are a 10th century sort of Balkan sect that ends up going across to Marseille or wherever and then into France. So it's like, okay, well, who knows? But the point is, it's been long understood in Christianity that actually the Catholic Church isn't really what Jesus was trying to create.
I was reading in Gibbon just the other day saying that if Jesus and the apostles were sort of suddenly, he didn't use this turn of phrase, but if they were suddenly quantum leaped into the 16th century St. Peter's, they'd be like, what religion is this?
Well, they'd agree with Martin Luther.
Maybe. Probably.
I mean, that's where the strength of Protestantism comes from. It's, look, this just isn't in the Bible. This isn't what Jesus was saying. You're frauds, basically. And so you can see why for the next 200 years, there's massive religious turmoil in Europe because there seems to be a good argument for it. But anyway, so
the Albigenses or Cathars,
Yeah.
sort of one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the earliest sort of big heresies. Because as far as Rome is concerned, that you're heretics.
oh yeah,
You deserve death for saying this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Going around and being meek.
and well, it's challenging the authority of the church and their doctrine.
Right, yeah.
That's what they and they burned hundreds of them to death, hundreds of them. But the thing about the Cathars is that many of them willingly leapt into the flames as martyrs. So they'd capture them, and when they captured them, the Cathars would throw themselves on the fire. It's like, okay, these guys are really serious.
Because there's the earliest church, the church of sort of the 3rd century AD, there's a strong tradition of martyrdom there, that it's one of the best things you can do.
Yep, which is where a lot of the saints come from.
So yeah, I've got a couple of quick paragraphs here then from Churchill on that. Churchill wrote, "During John's reign, one of the most cruel tragedies of world history had run its course in southern France. In the domains of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, there had grown up during several generations a heresy, sombre and austere in theory, but genial in practice. The Albigenses, or Cathars, or the purified, as they were called, dismissed altogether from the human mind the resurrection of the body, purgatory and hell. In their view, life on earth, in the flesh, was the work of Satan." So actually, very, very...
They were Gnostics.
yeah, I mean, it's super hard line.
Oh yeah.
It is, they are very zealous about their view, as much as Rome is.
Just to expand on what you're saying there, because I don't think what you're saying is exactly correct here. So this is why it's theorized that it comes from the Bogomil heresy, which is a Gnostic heresy that believes actually the material world is made by the demiurge, and the true God of Jesus is a kind of over-God that lies in the transcendent realm beyond the material realm. And so the purpose is to free your soul to arrive at that place through good works. And when he says the purified, the Cathars themselves called themselves the good Christians, which is a great name, I think. But the priests of the Cathars were called the perfect ones, the perfecti.
Yeah, it goes on to describe those.
Right, yeah. Sorry, I'm preempting him. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, exactly what you said. He goes on, the material phase of life, of being alive in the flesh, the material phase would soon pass, and the soul, freed from its accursed encumbrance, would be resumed in eternal bliss into the Godhead. The perfects, in quotes, of this cult practiced chastity and abstinence, and professed in principle a sincere wish for death. But the mass of the population, relieved from the oppression of supernatural terror, developed, we are assured, in the delicious climate of those regions, easy morals and merry character. Seems that one of the things of this is that people were happy, were more happy.
Yes. So
I don't need to worry about purgatory anymore.
The Occident had what the Occident is the origin of the troubadour culture, where you had wandering bards who'd go around playing songs, and people would have feasts and be merry, and everyone was happy, and they were quite soft and genial, and it's the sort of thing that climate does allow. And then you think, right, okay, what were the Northern Europeans thinking? And the Northern Europeans were thinking iron and fire and sword and cold, and so when the Northern Europeans get wind of this, and the Pope's like, I need you to kill them, the poor knights of the Occident were just not up to the task. They just weren't as tough.
The concept of purgatory in the early Middle Ages seems to have hung very heavy in people's minds, because there's one thing if you're an out-and-out sinner or you do things sort of overtly wrong, you're going to hell, okay, but it also seems it would be very, very easy to miss heaven and you end up in purgatory forever, a type of halfway house, and sometimes through no fault of your own and things. If people don't bury you in the right way, you can end up in purgatory and stuff, and it seems to have very much weighed on people's minds. So to be sort of relieved of that burden seems to have been a big thing.
Just a couple more things, I guess, before we go on with Churchill. One thing that was interesting about the Cathar heresy is that it was very appealing to women, because I can imagine that there were many women in the Middle Ages who did have husbands against their will, and so to be able to take a vow of chastity and effectively sequester, because a lot of them, what they would do is they would have their children quite young, obviously, raise their children, and then by their late 30s and early 40s, would take a vow of chastity. And so now, and it would be husbands, a guy's wife would take a vow of chastity. And it's like, okay, what do you do now? Okay, well, great. And then she'd go off and join, not a convent, but like a group of Cathars, and that would be it. And so that seemed to be something that was very appealing to quite a number of women, actually. They definitely had a lot more women taking those vows and becoming perfect ones than men. Just a note.
Churchill goes on, the thrilling sensation of being raised above the vicissitudes of this world and at the same time freed from the menaces of the next produced a great happiness in which all classes joined, and from it sprang culture and manners and fervour of conviction. He says, this casting off of all spiritual bonds was, naturally, unwelcome to the papacy. The whole moral scheme of the Western world was based, albeit precariously, upon original sin, redemption by grace, and a hell of infinite torment and duration, which could only be avoided through the ministrations of the clergy. So they're power-based, really. The Albigenses, the Cathars, are striking directly at the power of Rome, directly at it.
Yeah, consciously as well. Like they are well aware, and you can see it in the debates, because they have a series of debates. The Catholics send priests. Arnold Amaury is the cardinal who oversees it. Excuse me. And they send priests to have debates with the Cathars, and the Cathars treat them in the same way the social justice warriors treat you. They are screaming that they are hypocrites, infidels, liars, cheats, deceivers, and the Catholics are shocked that they can't have a reasonable discussion. The perfect ones are, and it's the only time you hear that they act in any sort of aggressive way, because of course they've taken a vow of non-violence and things like this. And so the spitting of blood basically at the Catholic faith, they nurtured some sort of deep grievance against them. It wasn't just like, two intellectual clergymen having a discussion. It was like watching the SJWs on a university campus screaming at people.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.